Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack one of the most incredible, literally decades-long architectural feats in modern history. And no, we're not talking about constructing a massive skyscraper or some giant suspension bridge. We are talking about the construction of an entire country. We're going to map out the incredibly complex, fascinating, and honestly sometimes pretty turbulent journey of building an independent Nigeria, right up to the historic year of 1960.
Okay, let's dive into this. How on earth do you build a single nation out of 250 totally distinct ethnic groups? I mean, before Nigeria was a single entity, it was home to these amazingly diverse, thriving societies. You had the sophisticated Islamic governance of the Sokoto Caliphate up in the north, the powerful Oyo Empire and Benin Kingdom in the west and south, and then these highly decentralized, completely self-governing Igbo communities in the east. But then, in 1914, British Governor-General Lord Frederick Lugard comes in and just amalgamates these vastly different territories into one single protectorate. He merged over 250 distinct ethnic groups. And this wasn't for the benefit of the people, right? It was purely for the administrative and economic convenience of the colonial rulers. So you can imagine this single act created an absolutely immense challenge for anyone trying to build a unified future nation.
And that basically brings us to the finish line. Well, actually scratch that. It's more like the starting line. October 1st, 1960 is widely celebrated as Nigeria's Independence Day. But if we look a little closer, this wasn't just some spontaneous overnight celebration. It was way more like the grand ribbon cutting of this highly complex, pretty fragile building that had been meticulously and definitely contentiously negotiated for decades. To really grasp the sheer weight of what happened in 1960, we got to look at the colonial blueprints that the Nigerian people were suddenly forced to untangle.
To understand those early blueprints, we have to look at one of the biggest initial cracks in the foundation, which was a system called indirect rule. This was Lord Lugard's grand strategy to govern by using existing local traditional leaders to basically enforce British policies. Now sure, this worked relatively well up in the north, where the emirs already held strong centralized authority. But down in the south, it was a massive headache. It was a restrictive, one-size-fits-all approach that caused so much friction. For instance, communities like the Igbo didn't traditionally have central rulers, so imposing this system basically meant slapping a foreign blueprint onto a society that operated in a completely different way. As you can guess, it sparked some deep resentment and really laid the groundwork for serious resistance.
Out of all that resistance emerged some genuinely brilliant minds. Chief among them was Herbert Macaulay, who is widely regarded as the father of Nigerian nationalism. You actually might recognize his iconic mustache from the 1 Naira note. But here's what's absolutely fascinating, and honestly kind of ironic. Macaulay was actually a British-trained civil engineer. He took that British education, combined it with his sharp legal knowledge, and basically used it to outsmart the colonial government at their own game. In 1921, he actually went to Britain to represent the King of Lagos and successfully won back the Apapa land the British had tried to seize. Talk about hitting the nail on the head. He went on to co-found the Lagos Daily News to call out the government, and then created Nigeria's first political party, the NNDP. He was this fierce, opportunistic fighter who really drew up the very first blueprints for an independent Nigeria.
Macaulay's activism essentially kick-started this rapid-fire, high-stakes game of constitutional chess. As nationalist pressure kept mounting, you had cautious British administrators scrambling to draft new blueprints, while eager Nigerian leaders kept pushing and demanding way more power. So, in a super short span of time, we see this rapid evolution. You've got the Richards Constitution in 1946, the Macpherson Constitution in 1951, and then the Littleton Constitution in 1954. Boom, boom, boom. Each one of these was just a reaction to the last. Basically, the British trying desperately to manage the growing demands of a highly politically awakened populace.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer contrast between where this whole chess match started and where it ended up. The 1946 Richards Constitution, it was heavily criticized, mostly because it was drafted all the way on London and just imposed on Nigerians without any real consultation. It kind of acknowledged regional diversity but offered a really limited franchise. But then, less than a decade later, the 1954 Littleton Constitution changed the whole shebang. Drafted after some really intense conferences in both London and Lagos, this became Nigeria's first genuine federal constitution. It granted massive autonomy and serious executive control right to the regional governments, a real game changer.
So with all this new federal power, 3 distinct regional giants emerged. You can kind of think of them as 3 different foremen on a massive construction site, each trying to build their section of the nation using entirely different ideologies. In the north, you had the Northern People's Congress, or NPC, led by Ahmadu Bello. They were really focused on traditional agriculture and gradual reform. Over in the east, Nnamdi Azikiwe led the NCNC, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, and he was all about economic nationalism and industrialization. And then in the west, you had Obafemi Awolowo leading the Action Group. He was heavily pushing progressive federalism and launched this unprecedented free universal primary education program. So they were absolutely united in wanting independence for sure, but they were deeply divided on exactly how the house should be built.
Obviously, to keep these wildly differing visions from completely tearing the whole project apart, they had to pull off this super delicate mathematical balancing act. During the 1950 Ibadan General Conference, a really critical resolution was made about the central legislature. They finally agreed that the northern region, simply because of its massive population, would hold exactly 50% of the seats. The southern regions would hold the other 50%. This delicate compromise was absolutely essential to keeping the federation intact. And here's why this matters so much. The structures and the quotas they hammered out back in 1950 quite literally laid the very foundations of modern Nigerian political power sharing.
Let's move along and see how this builds because, well, fragile compromises usually don't hold forever. The system quickly began to buckle, building into what was almost a catastrophic crisis. That 1951 McPherson Constitution we mentioned, it quickly broke down under the immense weight of those regional tensions. By 1953, the system totally fractured. We saw the Eastern Regional Crisis, which was then followed by Action Group member Anthony Enaharo moving this bold, highly controversial motion demanding Nigeria's independence by 1956. This was flat-out rejected by northern leaders who felt their region just wasn't ready yet. This led to some severe political friction and, tragically, culminating in the Kano riot of 1953. At that point, it became painfully clear that without giving the regions significantly more autonomy to govern themselves, the entire Nigerian project might just collapse.
And that brings us to a massively pivotal year, 1957. By this point, the momentum for self-rule was absolutely unstoppable. Following some really intense constitutional conferences, 1957 became the year the eastern and western regions were officially granted self-government. It was also the year that Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, who was this incredibly calm diplomatic leader from the north, was appointed as Nigeria's very first prime minister. The northern region would go on to achieve its own self-government shortly after, in 1959. So you can see it happening. The scaffolding was finally coming down. The nation was getting ready to stand completely on its own 2 feet.
Which leads us to the breathtaking climax of this entire journey, October 1st, 1960. Across the entire country, the air was just electric. The Union Jack was officially lowered, and that beautiful green-white-green flag was finally raised into the sky. Prime Minister Balewa took to the podium and declared, "At last our great day has arrived, and Nigeria is now indeed an independent sovereign nation." It was such a profound moment of triumph. Decades of resistance, of fiery newspaper editorials, of worker strikes, and unbelievably complex political chess had finally paid off.
So the crucial point we have to remember here is that while the celebration was 100% well-deserved, the architects of this independent Nigeria inherited a highly fragile structure. I mean, those intense regional rivalries we talked about from the 1950s, they didn't just magically vanish at the stroke of midnight in 1960. The colonial legacy of divide and rule left behind some incredibly deep economic and educational disparities, particularly between the North and the South. The political parties were still heavily tied to their specific ethnic and regional bases, which, as you can imagine, immediately began to put stress on the brand new national government.
Which leaves us with a really profound question to reflect on as we wrap up this explainer. As we look back at the absolutely incredible feat of building Nigeria, we really have to ask, did independence truly heal the deep divisions that were planted during the colonial era, or did it merely pass those incredibly complex historical blueprints directly into Nigerian hands? Understanding this journey to 1960 is absolutely vital, because those very same foundational debates about regionalism, about power, and about unity, well, they continue to shape the beautiful, complex architecture of Nigeria today. Keep that in mind as you explore more about this fascinating nation. Thanks so much for learning with me today.